But without further ado, I'm going to start up. I'm using Storyboard 6.2 for this demo, but scrolling is a feature that's been around for a while with Storyboard. So if you're using an older version, this should still work for you, this follow through. Okay, so scrolling. Scrolling is very important, especially if you have a lot of content on your application. If you have long text paragraphs that are longer than like your screen bounds, if you have dynamic lists that keep changing, and you want to keep populating that dynamically, and as the list grows, you want to be able to scroll them. Scrolling is essential for especially like information heavy UIs. And I'm going to be showing you some examples today. Before we get into how to actually implement scrolling into your application, I'm going to show you an example of some terms that I'm going to be using throughout the session today. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to use one of our sample projects that are shipped with Storyboard Designer. So when you have a copy of Storyboard Designer, we ship a bunch of projects that already come with the application to show off some extra features, kind of like a do-it-yourself, learn-yourself method. So you can dive into the project and see how different tools are used within Storyboard Designer. So today I'm going to start by importing sample project. And this shows you all of the samples that we have available with Storyboard. Today we're just going to be using just a couple ones on scrolling. To start off with, I'll start with scrolling layers. So this is our scrolling layers sample project. And basically, I'm just going to use this to demonstrate the difference between scrolling and dragging. So today you'll hear me use the word scroll or drag constantly throughout the session. And there is a difference. In general, we usually refer to moving content as scrolling or scrollable. But in the terms of the actual action of it, we use scroll or drag. So with this example of the scrolling layer, if I click and drag my mouse slowly, this is called a drag. So this means that the content follows the same momentum as my touch point. So whether it's your finger or a mouse, the scrolling layer moves with the same pace as my mouse. So I'm just clicking and holding and moving my mouse side to side. You can see there's a nice parallax effect here. I can talk about that later if you're interested. But this is what we call dragging. And then scrolling in Storyboard sense is when I click my mouse and I kind of flick it and let go like this. So I'm flicking my mouse, and you can see it kind of takes on like a nice pace with the animation. And that's what we refer to as scrolling. So when a scroll is triggered, that means that there's kind of an automatic animation, and you can change the properties of this scroll animation that comes in automatically. The momentum of it, how fast it decays, any sort of bounce you want. You can customize that to your needs. Yeah, so that's what I talk about when I say drag. So dragging is manually dragging it and then letting go, and then a scroll is a click and flick almost. Okay, I hope that's a good intro for what scrolling versus dragging means. But now I'm going to start into the actual tutorial. So I'm going to close that. I already have a project created. As Scott mentioned, we'll be posting this online for you to follow later and add your own functionality to and play around with it hands-on. But for now, this is a good starting point for us. So this is an application we created as a demo for today. As you can see, we have like a nice list, like a settings list with some toggle buttons and some step-by-step timeline here. Right now, I'm interacting with it. There's no scrolling enabled on this project. All I can interact with right now is the toggle points on the settings menu. But what I want to do is I want to scroll this timeline to get to the other steps, and I want to be able to see the entire list here. So we'll dive right in with that. Okay. Sorry, I'm just minimizing some of this. Okay. So the first thing you'll notice when you see my project is I have my screen. If you're familiar with Storyboard, you'll recognize that this is my content screen. I have a couple layers. I have a scrolling layer, and I also have a table layer, and then my background. But if you notice, I have a horizontal view here of my screen. It's a duplicate of my existing screen. What this is called is a design state. So what a design state is it's kind of like a snapshot of your application of what it will look like later on in your project during runtime. So this is the goal I'm trying to achieve with my scrolling layer. I know that there are other steps in this timeline, and I want to be able to scroll to these bottom ones here. Design states are really helpful because right now I can't scroll easily in Designer to see the bottom of this timeline, but if I wanted to edit the text, say on step 3 or 4, I can easily do that with my design state that I have set up. So a design state is just a snapshot of your screen. And I set it to show the bottom of my timeline. So I adjusted the Y position of my scrolling layer so I can see kind of where the layer. So if I select the layer in my navigator, you can see that to create this design state, all I did was shift the width. So made the width much longer, the height much longer, and then shifted the Y into the negatives so that I can see the bottom half of my scrolling layer, which I can't see right now in Designer. So now within master context, I can easily change, some of this text here. For step 3, if I wanted to change, the font colors, so I can still interact with the bottom half of my scrolling layer in Designer without having to go into runtime. Before design states, I would have to edit it in Designer, run my application, scroll to the bottom, make sure it looks good. But with design states, I can easily set it up so I can see what's happening. Okay, so that's a little bit about the starting point of our project. So like I mentioned before, I have 2 instances of scrolling here. I have a table that we're going to be scrolling, and then also a layer. So scrolling layers and scrolling tables are very similar in terms of scrolling. The differences are tables. So I go into my table layer here. A table is a storyboard control. And like you're familiar with other editing softwares, maybe something like Word or Excel, we have tables here, just rows and columns with their own kind of theme. So right now I have it set up in my table with my cell templates that my first column are the switches. So the first column has just one image, and they're all uniform with the same image, same size, same placement. And then my second column is the settings names. So my table is very uniform. Tables are a plus when you want to have, very even uniformity throughout your list with different columns and rows. It's easy to set up your table that way. And then on the other pro, we have scrolling layer. So scrolling layer, the benefits of that is you're not really bound to any sort of formatting. There's no rows or layers. It's totally up to you. So you can see that my scrolling list that I have set up here on the timeline is a little all over the place. There's no strict, column 1 has even spacing. All of my steps have different size boxes here, different content. So this is why I would use something like a scrolling layer for this timeline view. So when you're thinking about adding a list or content to your application, it's good to weigh the differences between scrolling layers and scrolling tables. Yeah, and then both of them you can still interact with them using events and actions like I demonstrated with the scrolling table settings menu here. I was able to interact with each individual switch and toggle them back on and off. The difference is that when you map an event, you either map it by row column, so like a cell of a table, versus when you interact with a scrolling layer, you're interacting with controls or touch points like you would in a normal app without scrolling. Those are the differences between the two. But in terms of scrolling, they behave the exact same way. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to enable some scrolling on our layers. So in my project, I have my scrolling layer in my application model here. I'm on this the layer level of the model. So we consider the hierarchy here of your application to be the application model. So if you hear me say that, that's what I'm referring to. So in my application model, on my layer level, if I go into the properties panel on the side here, you can see that I have this panel here called scrolling. Right now it's all grayed out because it's not enabled. So if I enable scrolling, automatically now it's just as easy as that. You can have scrolling enabled on your layer. Some of the defaults, we want it to be vertical orientation, which is good. And then enabling that flick gesture. So that's what I showed at the beginning when that scrolling layer sample. So enabling the flick gesture allows for that automatic scroll that happens. And you can change some of these animation properties here. So what the decay means is how fast it will slow the pace of your automatic scroll. So you can adjust that depending on what you want, the look and feel you're going for. And then friction, again, is friction just is like a scale of how much you have to flick for it to trigger. Like it's hard to explain, but it's good to play around with these numbers and see the differences between them and what's more comfortable for your user and to match the other animations in your project. And then for your other properties, there's also a bounce, which means that once you scroll to your bounds, it'll go a little bit further than that and then snap back to the original point. And then top padding and bottom padding in the case of vertical just means that there's a little extra cushion on the top and bottom of your scrolling layer. So it's not that your content goes right to the top of this layer and padding before where your content starts and after. And then lastly, there's this snap to pixels. So this means when that automatic scroll happens, it'll naturally come to a fraction of the snap. So if you want to snap to every 100 pixels, once your automatic scrolling, the flick gesture ends, it'll always end a multiple of 100. So that's helpful for things like uniform, a menu screen maybe where you have a bunch of different options in the menu. You always want it to snap so that one of your menu items is directly in the center. That's how you would implement that with scrolling. So that's how we do it with the scrolling layer. Another note on padding is the reason we add padding in here is because the bounds of your scrolling layer are kind of the viewpoint, what makes it up. So my content on the scrolling layer sets the bounds for how much scrolling there is. So my middle line starts here, and then step 4 at the bottom, it ends at the bottom right here. That is going to make up the entire content of what's scrollable. To lengthen your scrolling layer, you don't add to the height in the properties panel. So instinctively you think, oh, I'm going to scroll this layer because it's really long, so I have to make my height really long to match that. That's not what's happening. We're not actually changing the Y or the height when we do a scroll. If you see my scrolling bounds in my screen editor here, we have this blue outline, and that's my bounding box. You can see that the height of my scrolling layer matches the height of my application. So this acts as a clipping area. If I were to make the height of my layer much shorter, it would clip, but I'm still able to scroll within it. So what scrolling does is it takes the content within your layer and moves the offset of that. You're not actually interacting with the height and the Y of your layer. So set up your layer bounds to be the clipping area that you want, and then your content will move inside of it. So don't worry if your content is outside of your layer bounds. That's what scrolling is for. You don't have to make your scrolling layer extra long or extra wide to fit all of the content. If you do that, scrolling will not work. So if I were to make my height the same height as all of my content and I enabled scrolling, you'll notice that when I simulate it, I won't be able to scroll the way I expect to. So that's a good note when you set up your scrolling layers. Okay, so I have scrolling enabled on my layer, and now we're going to run it to see what it looks like. So I'm just going to simulate my storyboard project. And now if I click and drag on my steps here, you can see I have my scrolling layer set up, and I can get to the bottom steps and everything looks good to me. I also have that flick gesture enabled. So, and I have the bounce enabled as well. So there's that 50%. So it goes a little bit past the bounds and then snaps back to the top. Yeah. So very easy to set up a scrolling layer initially. And just to demonstrate, I'm going to change some of these parameters just to show you the difference. So I'm going to increase the decay a little bit. I'll just make it 3000. And then for friction, I'm going to make it something like 30, just to see the difference in the scrolling layer. So you see that automatic scroll doesn't last as long. It's very almost stiff is the word I would use. It decays a lot faster. There's not as much of a glide after you flick. I'm clicking and flicking, and there is not much scroll, but this is definitely very helpful for a shorter list. If you had a very long list, you want to decrease that decay so that a little flick goes a long way with the layer. But on a shorter list like this, something with a larger decay means that it's not as easy for the user to automatically flick to the bottom of the list and back up to the top. If they're trying to get somewhere in the middle, it's easier to change that with the decay. Okay, so that's how you set up your scrolling layer. In your scrolling table, it's the same thing. So if you go to the scrolling table layer, you have to select the table control because it's not a scrolling layer. So we're going to enable the scrolling on the table level of my application model. So I have the application model table selected, and then in properties, we get the exact same option here in the properties for the table. We're going to enable scrolling. And then again, we want the vertical. I'm going to leave it to the height of the cells. So I always want to have my cells be full. I don't want like a half cell at the top. So to do that, I'm going to check what the height is of a row. So I have one of my cells selected in the application model, and the height of that is 80. So if I go back to my table level, I can turn on snapping. And if I put 80 pixels, which is the height of my cells, when I enable the flick, it will snap to, I'm at the bottom here, so it's snapping to the bottom. But if I go up to the top, you can see that I always snap to the top of the cell, which is the 80. If I had that turned off, it would, if I dragged to show you, if I had the snap turned off with the flick gesture, it would, every time I would end, it could be something like this. So enabling the flick is helpful that you want your application to scroll naturally and end on the size of your cell. So yeah, that is how to enable scrolling, the basics. As Scott mentioned, the good thing about Storyboard is you can accomplish a lot without having to dive into code. So everything I've done so far, we've not used any Lua scripting. This is totally touch and click, and we're able to enable scrolling on both a layer and a table with just one checkbox, pretty much. Yeah, so that is tables and layers, how to enable it. So I mentioned before that when we're actually scrolling, you might want to know what's happening behind the scenes. I mentioned with the scrolling layer that the bounds of your layer are not dictating the bounds of your scroll, because we're not actually animating the Y or the height of your layer. What we're animating is called the offset. So we're animating in this case, both of our scrolling items are vertical scrolls. What we're doing here is we are animating the Y offset in both cases. So the Y offset is not something that you can simulate in Designer. It is a runtime variable. So to see those variables, I have my scrolling layer selected. Then I go to the variables panel here at the bottom. Right now I'm filtering, so it's only the layer variables. Right now, there's nothing here because we don't have any custom variables created. But there's the option to turn on internal variables, which is what we're interested in today. If I show that toggle, you can see that here are a bunch of variables that are automatic with all layers. These come instantly. They're always named the same. But what we're interested here is this GRD Y offset, which is the offset of your content to the layer bounds. So if our Y is at 0, but our content is off screen, it'll have a different Y offset. So if you want to easily change the position of your content without, moving the whole layer, a good thing to change is this Y offset variable. So you can do that either with a Storyboard data change action or in Lua. You just have to target this Y offset or X offset if you're horizontal content. You're changing this. But if as a demonstration, if I change this value, you can see it doesn't do anything in Designer, but it is a runtime variable. So a good way to demonstrate that this is what's changing is there's the option with variables to add an event. So what the event column here in the variables table means is every time that this variable changes values, it's going to trigger an event. So I'm going to name this layer Y offset change. Save that. And now on my application level of my project, if I add a new action, my trigger event was called layer Y offset change. So that's the custom event I just created. And then just as a quick note, we're going to go to Lua just quickly, and I'm just going to print layer Y offset. So I'm just going to create the Lua function quickly here in my project. And all I want to do is I want to print that value. So I'm going to use the Storyboard function, so get value. I'm going to grab the name of that variable that I'm interested in, which is the Y offset of the scrolling layer. I'm going to right click on that, copy path. And now when I go into Lua, I can paste that in there. And now when I run my project and scroll on the layer, oops, I have some errors here. That's what we need. So another note, good to show you, when you are accessing the Y offset of a layer, it's important to put the screen name before that variable, because if you're aware with storyboard models, layers can be shared across multiple screens, which means that each layer on a screen is considered a layer instance, and Y offsets can change depending on your layer instance. So you can have your Y offset on one screen be one value, and then on another screen have a different value. So all you have to do is add the screen name before that. So I'm going to copy the path of the screen name. Automatically, when you copy paths of variables for layers, it does not include the screen name, so it's a good note to add that. Now when I simulate my project and then drag my layer, you can see in my console, I have all these values printed out. So when I'm at the top of my layer, it defaults to 0, but then any scrolling after that is considered a negative value all the way to the bottom. So this is always a good tip when you are creating new layers. If you're going to add some more complicated functionality, other than just the generic enable scrolling, it's a good idea to get the bounds of your layer, scrolling layer. So right now I know that the very bottom, it's going to be 507, and then at the very top, it's 0. You can see that the numbers sometimes go into the positives like that. That's just because we have that bounce enabled to 50. So the highest I'll go is 50, and then the other way around as well. So if you're curious on what the scrolling actually does, it's the Y offset that we're changing, and you can see the values that way. We're also changing the Y offset for the tables as well. Yeah, so when I added that action for the custom event, printing out the variables, you might have noticed that when I typed in layer, there's all these extra built-in events that come with Storyboard. You have your drags and your scrolls. So I can quickly talk about those. If I go into our help center on our website, Scott mentioned this before, we have a bunch of documentation here for events, Lua APIs, stuff like that. Here I'm just going to do scroll events. You can see that I have 2 entries here for table scroll events and then layer scrolls. So for the table scroll, here are some automatic events that come when you enable scrolling on a table. So once you enable scrolling on your table, these events automatically are available to you. So we have the same differences I mentioned before, drag versus scroll. And basically, when they are triggered are when you can start a drag and stop a drag. And then there's a difference of when your scroll is triggered. So right when you drag long enough and your velocity is fast enough that it will trigger a flick gesture, that's when the scroll is trigger event will happen. When the scroll animation plays, that's when your scroll start will trigger. When the scrolling naturally comes to an end. And then also canceling, like if you press the layer and stop the scroll or leave the screen, scroll cancel will happen. So all of this information is available to you via events. So if you want to say, change the, if you have like a scrolling menu and whatever in the center, you want to increase the size, these events will be helpful to you. So you know that once the scroll comes naturally to an end using something like scroll complete, on that event is when you can trigger the size change for what's in the middle. So this gives you some more information on your scroll and can react to it differently. You can update a scroll bar Like I said, you can highlight the center item if you want, or the top layer. This is some information there, so you can get some reaction events for the scroll and drag. They're the same for layers as well. It's just the same timing happens. It's just under layer events instead of scroll table events. Okay, so we have a bit of time left. Last couple things I wanted to cover were scroll bars and infinite scrolling. Both of these are achievable with your project. They are a little Lua heavy, so I'm not going to be doing them from scratch in this webinar. The knowledge base we'll post after will have more of a step-by-step guide on how to do that. But for a webinar, I'm just going to show you some sample projects that we have that already demonstrate infinite scrolling and scroll bars. So I'm importing a sample project and scroll bar. So this is a project that we ship with Storyboard that demonstrates a working scroll bar. So if I simulate it, you can click and drag on the scroll bar and it will update this table list here. And then it works the opposite way. When you scroll on the table, it will update your scroll. So both dragging and scrolling is enabled on this table. There's the option to disable dragging, so I can't interact with the table, but I can still update it using the scroll bar. So this is a common flow with a lot of applications, especially something like a really long list or paragraph of text. You could use something like this. So the scroll bar is pretty simple in concept, but again, it takes some math, so we're not going to be walking through exactly how to do it, but I'll describe exactly how it's being achieved. So what we have is our table of cells, just like we had before with our other application. And then we have this scroll bar control here. So we have the actual bar, which is like the little lighter color here, and then the background. And all we do is on these scroll bars, we have this vent to press. So once the user is actually pressing the scroll bar, we're setting a flag variable just saying that the scroll bar is being pressed. And then we're checking for this event called motion on the layer. So what motion is every time, either with a mouse, you get a lot more motion events because I'm not actually pressing anything on the screen. I can still get motion events with my cursor. But on a physical touchscreen with a UI, motion events are only triggered when someone is pressing on the actual screen and moving it around on the screen. If you think of an actual screen, if I just hover my finger over the screen, obviously we don't get that information of their touch points, so the motion event won't be triggered that way. But simulating with a mouse, anytime my cursor moves on this layer, you'll get motion events. And then what motion events does, I'm just going to drive into these events. And basically what you do, again, if you are curious in adding a scroll bar, feel free to check out the sample with your installation. But I can just walk through high level what's happening. Basically what you do is you check if it's being pressed, and then if it is, you're getting the value of that motion point, so where the X and the Y are there. And then you scale the ratio between your table and then also the scroll bar. And when you move the scroll bar, you set the value, you update the table, and you set the Y offset, that same variable that we were talking about before. You just update the Y offset of your table depending on the Y offset of the Y position of your scroll bar. So it takes a little bit of math. It changes depending on the size of your table and the size of your scroll bar, but basically you want to have the same bounds of your scroll bar background to be the same size as your total table, and then you connect them that way. So they react to each other. Every time you touch and move the scroll bar, you want to update the Y offset of your table, and vice versa. If you update the Y offset of your table, you want to change the position of your scroll bar. So that's where those variable events come in handy. You can see that on the scrolling table, when we move the Y offset, we update the scroll bar. So just like I mentioned before, these reacting to these variable changes are how you achieve the scroll bar connection. Yeah, so that's a little bit on scroll bars. So the same thing with infinite list, we have a sample for that as well. Open that up quickly. Now what an infinite list is, we use that term quite frequently. It's basically when you have a bunch of dynamic content that you don't want to, when you have a lot of dynamic content that's just not practical to keep all hard-coded in your project. So if you had, thousands of menu options, or like if say you had a cooking app and you had a bunch of recipes that were dynamic populated and you had so many images on them, obviously you don't want to have all those images bogging down your performance, all hard-coded in your project. So an infinite list helps with that. Basically, as it says here, you have 10,000 items within 60 cells. So when we say infinite list, what we're talking about is I can just keep scrolling forever and ever. And technically, there's only 60 cells here that are just being repopulated. So to achieve the infinite list look is you have a bunch of cells that are still out of bounds. So enough cells that you can easily scroll naturally to the bottom. But once you get to a certain Y offset, you can repopulate the table cells with different content. So change all the this table cell variable names to a different content, and then adjust your Y offset back to like the beginning. So you keep, once you get to a certain bounds, you repopulate everything underneath, shift the Y offset seamlessly, and then keep scrolling. So this is a good tutorial on how to, again, if you have a lot of content that's bogging down your list, all you need are a few cells for it to be naturally scrollable. And then anything outside of those cells, you just populate kind of behind the scenes. So once they're off screen, you change the content around. The user won't know that you're doing that. So it's kind of a seamless transition. Again, these examples are a bit math heavy, so I won't go into detail, but if you're curious on how this is achieved, feel free to check out the sample. And again, we'll be talking about it on the knowledge base article more if you're curious. Yeah, so that's all I had planned for this scrolling content today. Let me know if you have any questions. If you have questions about how these table buttons are working, anything about scrolling, let me know. I don't have anything else planned, so we can jump into questions in the Q&A.
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. Let me just kind of jump back to showing my screen. All right, just to kind of quickly wrap things up before we jump into the Q&A, just giving you a chance to take advantage of a live Q&A session by posing your questions that you have to Sarah. So key takeaways, definitely, if you haven't been to the Help Center, like I said, and like Sarah said, and like she showed you live, there is a wealth of information there within our knowledge base articles that we have.